SCP-049 is to be contained within a secure humanoid containment cell at Site-19, Research Sector 02. The entity must remain sedated before transport and restrained, using a Class 3 humanoid restriction harness under constant guard surveillance. Direct physical contact with SCP-049 is prohibited. Lavender has been shown to calm hostile behavior and should be applied if necessary. To maintain its compliance, SCP-049 is periodically provided with deceased animal specimens for study. All cadavers reanimated as SCP-049-2 instances are to be removed and incinerated. Following Containment Committee Order 049-S19.17.1, SCP-049 is indefinitely prohibited from interaction with Foundation personnel or human cadavers until reassessment is concluded. SCP-049 is a humanoid entity approximately 1.9 meters tall, resembling a medieval plague doctor. Its garments and mask are fused with its form, grown organically from its body rather than worn. Beneath this layer, a humanoid skeleton has been confirmed by radiography. SCP-049 is capable of fluent multilingual communication, primarily in English and medieval French. It consistently references a concept it calls the pestilence, an unidentified condition it claims spreads unchecked among humans. Despite extensive research, the Foundation has been unable to confirm or classify this phenomenon. Direct skin contact with SCP-049 is lethal. All biological functions cease instantly, though the mechanism remains unknown. After terminating subjects, SCP-049 typically performs crude surgical procedures using antique instruments carried in a black doctor's bag. These interventions result in SCP-049-2, reanimated corpses devoid of higher cognition, but capable of basic motor function and violent aggression when provoked or directed. While the procedures vary, SCP-049 invariably insists that its victims have been cured of the pestilence. Autopsy reports and biological examinations of SCP-049-2 reveal altered physiology inconsistent with natural human biology, though no trace of infection has ever been identified. Containment remains stable but precarious. SCP-049's demeanor is cooperative when unprovoked, often polite and formal in its interactions with staff, but unpredictable when perceiving the presence of the pestilence. It has expressed remorse following its lethal interventions, but refuses to acknowledge them as failures, describing its work as necessary medical progress. Foundation oversight stresses minimal engagement and absolute prohibition of live human experimentation. The anomaly was first encountered during an investigation into a string of unexplained disappearances in Montauban, a town in southern France. Local authorities had received multiple reports of missing persons over the course of several weeks, though no signs of forced entry, theft, or violence were recorded in the initial police inquiries. Concern grew when an entire household was reported silent for days, curtains drawn and doors locked, with neighbors recalling strange, muffled sounds and the faint scent of decay wafting from the residence. Upon forced entry, investigators found several mutilated bodies in advanced states of alteration. What stood out was that some of these corpses exhibited movement despite clear evidence of death. The cadavers lurched forward with jerky motions, mouths open in guttural moans, responding with aggression to the intrusion. These were the first documented instances of what the Foundation would later classify as SCP-049-2. Among the chaos of law enforcement engagement, during which several officers sustained injuries before dispatching the entities, a figure was discovered calmly observing the scene. Clad in archaic plague doctor garb, the figure scribbled notes into a leather-bound journal, seemingly unfazed by the violence. When confronted, the entity identified itself as a physician of sorts, claiming it was studying and treating those afflicted. It offered no resistance when restrained, and instead engaged its captors in conversation, alternating between medieval French and halting English. The arresting officers noted its peculiar politeness, its repeated references to the pestilence, and its insistence that the grotesque figures had been patients under its care. Upon Foundation intervention, SCP-049 was transferred into custody with minimal resistance. Records indicate that the entity even expressed relief, remarking that the Foundation's facilities appeared clean and free of the scourge. It insisted that collaboration was mutually beneficial, suggesting that it could continue its work in a proper laboratory setting. At this early stage, researchers believed SCP-049 to be a delusional, though anomalous, individual. Only later did the full danger of its capabilities become evident. Initial interviews, conducted by Dr. Raymond Ham, revealed an unsettling conviction in its mission. SCP-049 described the pestilence as a ubiquitous and deadly blight, one not tied to known historical plagues, but rather an unseen corruption of the human condition. Its testimony was riddled with archaic terminology and cryptic medical analogies. When asked about the reanimated bodies, SCP-049 dismissed concerns, claiming its surgeries were the cure most effective, though it conceded its methods were not yet perfected. The Foundation's records from this discovery phase are fragmented, as many reports were redacted or classified at higher levels. What remains paints the picture of an anomaly that was not captured through struggle, but instead walked willingly into containment. It demonstrated a sense of purpose rather than fear, as if its apprehension was merely the next stage of its work. Observers consistently reported feelings of unease in its presence, even when it was cooperative, describing its demeanor as strangely human, yet subtly wrong. It gestured with theatrical confidence, its masked visage always tilted slightly toward its audience, as if studying every breath and heartbeat for signs of infection. The town of Montauban bore the brunt of SCP-049's presence. Subsequent investigations revealed mass graves on the outskirts, filled with incomplete surgical experiments and malformed cadavers. Families of the missing were never fully informed of the true nature of their loved one's fate. The Foundation suppressed local news coverage, attributing the deaths to a series of botched chemical experiments in an illegal laboratory. A narrative of toxic exposure and gas leak fatalities was distributed to avoid suspicion. It was in this moment of discovery that the Foundation began to grasp the scale of the anomaly. SCP-049 was not a wandering curiosity to be observed, but an active, deliberate agent of change, carrying out procedures with the certainty of a man convinced of his righteous purpose. The disappearances in Montauban became the first recorded outbreak attributed to SCP-049, though the entity itself insisted this was merely a small clinic compared to the epidemic it claimed to be fighting. For the Foundation, the discovery marked the beginning of a long and uneasy custody of a being whose perception of medicine, life, and death was utterly alien, yet disturbingly methodical. SCP-049's initial containment allowed the Foundation to conduct a series of controlled trials. The first encounter was deceptively simple. The entity was provided with a D-class subject and asked to demonstrate its claimed medical expertise. It began by posing routine questions in a calm, professional manner, scribbling notes as if conducting a standard examination. However, without warning, SCP-049 reached forward and placed its hand upon the subject's throat. Within seconds, all biological activity ceased. The corpse collapsed instantly, without evidence of trauma or struggle, the cause of death undetectable. Rather than acknowledging the act as a killing, SCP-049 expressed satisfaction, stating that the subject had been purged of corruption. It immediately began extracting instruments from its bag, including syringes filled with opaque fluids, clamps, scalpels worn with age, and tubing of copper and leather. The procedures it performed were crude yet deliberate, introducing strange substances into the circulatory system and reshaping the corpse's anatomy with a methodical precision. Hours later, the body twitched, then spasmed, before rising as the first documented SCP-0492 instance under Foundation observation. The reanimated subject displayed no cognition or memory, lurching forward with uneven steps, producing guttural sounds from a new orifice carved into its chest. The Foundation security team, ordered to intervene, dispatched the entity after it lunged at observers. Throughout this violent struggle, SCP-049 remained calm, taking notes and remarking aloud on the efficacy of his cure. After the termination of the reanimated corpse, SCP-049 returned willingly to containment, voicing only mild disappointment at the staff's lack of appreciation for progress. Subsequent tests with animal corpses produced similar results. A goat was altered into a staggering, uncoordinated construct, while the body of an orangutan underwent repeated procedures, each attempt producing progressively unstable reanimations. The orangutan's corpse was ultimately incinerated after SCP-049 declared that he had learned much from the failure. Despite mounting evidence of futility, the entity consistently insisted these results represented vital steps toward the perfect cure. One of the most disturbing observations occurred when SCP-049 was given the carcass of a bovine. Over several days, it carefully embalmed the corpse, balanced what it referred to as the humors, and finally applied electricity in a crude reanimation attempt. The body rose, its head inverted, its limbs rearranged in unnatural orientations, yet still walking. To the Foundation researchers, this was a grotesque aberration. To SCP-049, it was further confirmation of his progress. Interviews during this early phase revealed a pattern. When questioned about the exact nature of the pestilence, SCP-049 deflected with vague references to unseen corruption, decay of the spirit, and a universal sickness infecting mankind. It refused to clarify symptoms or mechanisms, claiming that most humans were too blind to perceive it. Researchers quickly concluded that the anomaly was driven by a pathological obsession, interpreting all life through the lens of this imagined disease. Nevertheless, SCP-049 displayed a peculiar blend of intellect and delusion. It documented each procedure meticulously in thick journals, which it occasionally offered to share with staff. Researchers described these journals as filled with archaic medical terminology, indecipherable diagrams, and elaborate, rambling notes that shifted between coherent observations and near-religious declarations. Foundation staff began to realize that beneath SCP-049's polite exterior was a relentless compulsion, one that would not be sated by argument or containment restrictions. At this stage, containment protocols were adjusted, human test subjects were restricted, and sedation procedures were updated in case of sudden aggression. But already the Foundation understood that SCP-049 was not a passive anomaly to be studied. It was a determined practitioner of a doctrine only it believed in, and its work would continue so long as it was permitted access to any form of organic material. The first interviews ended with SCP-049 politely requesting patience once more, confident that the Foundation would eventually recognize the necessity of his cure. SCP-049's physical description remained a subject of scrutiny throughout its early containment. Standing just under 2 meters tall, the entity bore the unmistakable appearance of a plague doctor from the 14th century: thick robes, gloves, and the long-beaked mask. Yet examinations quickly revealed these garments were not clothing at all. They were seamlessly fused to the body, organic extensions of its form. Attempts to remove even a fragment proved impossible. The material resisted cutting, burning, and chemical degradation. Radiographic scans confirmed a humanoid skeleton beneath the surface, though the tissues surrounding it could not be identified by any known biological standard. The mask, appearing ceramic at first glance, was found to be bone-like in density and structure. Beneath it, no facial features could be discerned. All attempts to penetrate deeper, whether by advanced imaging or surgical exploration, were denied by SCP-049's violent response to such intrusions. Even restrained and sedated, The entity exhibited signs of extreme distress when researchers attempted invasive study, forcing the Foundation to abandon direct anatomical exploration. SCP-049 spoke with eloquence and fluency, shifting between English and medieval French, though capable of using other tongues when prompted. Its voice carried an unsettling clarity, muffled slightly, as though emanating from within the mask, yet distinctly human in tone and cadence. Staff repeatedly noted that prolonged conversation left them uneasy, a sensation often described as being studied or diagnosed by the entity's unseen gaze. The most alarming property, however, was its lethal touch. Any direct skin contact with SCP-049 caused immediate and total biological failure in the victim. Organs ceased function simultaneously, as though life itself had been switched off. Autopsies revealed no trauma, no circulatory blockages, no neural collapse. Victims' cells simply presented as lifeless, their systems halted without identifiable cause. This phenomenon resisted analysis, and SCP-049 itself refused to explain the mechanism, dismissing inquiries with the assertion that the subject had succumbed to the pestilence. Following termination, SCP-049 inevitably began its procedures. Its doctor's bag, carried at all times, contained surgical tools of archaic make, scalpels dulled by centuries of use, syringes of brass and glass filled with viscous dark fluids, clamps, saws, and peculiar instruments with no recognizable medical purpose. Despite their crude appearance, these tools never seemed to degrade, and SCP-049 used them with practiced familiarity. The surgeries were chaotic by modern standards. Bones were rearranged, organs displaced or replaced, fluids forcibly introduced into veins. Yet SCP-049 worked with the composure of a skilled surgeon, narrating its process as though instructing unseen apprentices. The results of these operations were SCP-049-2, reanimated corpses stripped of personality and higher cognition. These entities possessed only rudimentary motor function, shambling with uneven gait and reacting aggressively to provocation or direct commands from SCP-049. They displayed altered physiology, some with additional limbs, others with inverted skeletal structures, or strange new orifices carved into their torsos. Despite their grotesque forms, they continued to demonstrate biological activity, albeit far removed from natural human or animal processes. To SCP-049, these abominations were triumphs. It repeatedly insisted that its patients were cured, liberated from the unseen affliction of the pestilence. When confronted with their mindlessness and aggression, SCP-049 expressed mild regret, but only in the context of imperfection in his technique. He regarded the failures as temporary setbacks in the long pursuit of the ultimate cure. Researchers noted an unsettling duality in SCP-049's demeanor: calm, polite, even charming in discourse, yet utterly merciless in application of its treatment. It showed no hesitation in ending a life, if convinced the pestilence was present, nor remorse in converting corpses into shambling constructs. For the Foundation, this left no doubt that containment was essential, not merely for the preservation of life, but to prevent SCP-049 from continuing his obsessive crusade unchecked. Through detailed observation, the Foundation built a clearer picture. SCP-049 was not simply a humanoid anomaly wearing archaic garb. It was a self-proclaimed physician of death and resurrection, bound to an unknowable definition of disease, driven by an obsession that ignored morality, science, and reality itself. In its mind, there was no ambiguity. All were ill, all could be cured, and it alone possessed the means to bring salvation. This conviction would prove more dangerous than any physical anomaly the Foundation could measure. The psychological and physical effects of SCP-049's presence on humans became increasingly evident as containment proceeded. Even without direct contact, staff reported a persistent unease during extended observation sessions. The entity's mannerisms, measured movements, unwavering attention, the way it inclined its head slightly while examining others, created a sensation of being scrutinized on a level deeper than physical appearance. Many described it as if SCP-049 could peer beneath the skin, searching for signs of an illness that no diagnostic instrument had ever confirmed. When physical interaction did occur, the results were immediate and catastrophic. Victims touched by SCP-049 collapsed instantly, all biological activity extinguished without visible injury. Autopsies were inconclusive, showing bodies intact yet lifeless, their systems inexplicably inert. Survivors did not exist. There were no partial exposures or recoveries. Even glancing contact proved fatal. This lethal ability created an atmosphere of constant anxiety within the containment team, as a single breach of protocol could erase a life in silence and without warning. The mental effects were more insidious. Individuals assigned long-term observation or interviews reported recurring nightmares, often involving masked figures pursuing them through sterile corridors or performing surgeries upon their restrained bodies. At least 2 junior researchers developed psychosomatic symptoms, persistent coughing, feverish episodes, and paranoia that they had contracted the pestilence despite repeated medical clearance. These symptoms invariably worsened after direct conversation with SCP-049, who would occasionally remark on their unhealthy pallor or faltering humors. Such comments, delivered with calm certainty, left lasting impressions that standard psychological counseling struggled to dispel. Testimonies from D-class subjects confirmed the overwhelming dread SCP-049 inspired. One subject described the sensation of being diagnosed before I spoke a word, while another insisted that the entity's unseen eyes followed my thoughts inside my skull. In post-test debriefings, survivors of mere proximity to SCP-049 expressed a paradoxical mixture of terror and fascination. They spoke of the entity with the reluctant respect one reserves for a highly competent physician, despite witnessing firsthand the grotesque outcomes of its treatments. Medical staff noted that SCP-049 displayed genuine empathy in certain interactions, consoling subjects moments before administering its lethal touch. It spoke softly, assuring them that they were afflicted but would soon be free of suffering. Victims often appeared entranced or oddly resigned, as if its words carried a subtle hypnotic influence. Whether this was the product of psychological manipulation, anomalous charisma, or the sheer weight of conviction in its voice remains uncertain. Regardless, few subjects attempted to resist once SCP-049 declared them infected. Psychological evaluations of Foundation personnel exposed to SCP-049 revealed a spectrum of effects ranging from heightened anxiety to obsessive interest. Some researchers reported intrusive thoughts about the pestilence, interpreting ordinary illnesses as signs of the anomaly's unseen plague. Others became preoccupied with the idea of a universal cure, entertaining SCP-049's theories even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of failure. Senior staff expressed concern that prolonged exposure risked subtle indoctrination, a gradual erosion of skepticism that might lead to dangerous lapses in containment judgment. Physically, SCP-049's patients, the reanimated 0492 instances, presented a disturbing contradiction. They functioned on a biological level, exhibiting circulation, muscle movement, and even respiration in some cases, yet their neurology was gutted. Electroencephalography revealed only erratic electrical discharges, insufficient to sustain consciousness or memory. Some instances displayed involuntary vocalizations, producing garbled cries or moans from artificially constructed orifices. These sounds were described by witnesses as haunting imitations of human suffering, amplifying the psychological toll of observation. In summary, SCP-049 exerted a dual influence. Direct contact brought immediate, inexplicable death, while extended interaction bred paranoia, fear, and an almost spiritual dread of contamination. It became clear to Foundation staff that SCP-049 was not only a physical anomaly, but also a psychological contagion. Its words carried weight beyond reason, and its mere presence inspired unease that lingered long after contact ended. The Foundation noted these factors as critical risks in containment, acknowledging that the true danger of SCP-049 extended far beyond its ability to kill. It lay also in its ability to convince. Experiments conducted with SCP-049 revealed as much about the Foundation's determination as they did about the anomaly's persistence. The earliest trials were designed to measure the mechanics of its so-called cure. D-Class personnel were introduced into the containment chamber under strict protocols, while medical staff monitored remotely. The outcomes were consistent and grim: termination through contact, followed by improvised surgery, and ultimately, the emergence of SCP-049-2. The first attempt to restrict SCP-049's access to its doctor's bag resulted in violent resistance. The entity protested loudly, insisting that such interference would doom humanity. When researchers relented and returned the bag, SCP-049 immediately calmed, resuming its meticulous procedures with renewed energy. The Foundation concluded that the bag was integral not only to its practice but also to its psychological stability. Later inspections of the bag's contents confirmed that many tools were centuries old, others entirely unrecognizable. Fluids extracted for chemical analysis defied classification, breaking down into inert residue within hours, as if losing potency once removed from SCP-049's custody. Attempts to neutralize or interrupt the surgeries often produced violent outcomes. In one trial, security teams entered mid-procedure to confiscate the corpse. The nearly completed SCP-049-2 lashed out in confusion, injuring 2 guards before being destroyed. SCP-049 responded with visible distress, berating staff for slaughtering a patient on the cusp of salvation. From that point, it refused to cooperate for several weeks, scribbling furiously in its journals and muttering about blind men in a burning ward. One of the most unusual experiments involved providing SCP-049 with animal cadavers. With a goat, it achieved partial reanimation, remarking on the rudimentary stage of the disease. With an orangutan, however, SCP-049 worked obsessively, attempting multiple resurrections. The repeated failures seemed to unsettle it, though rather than conceding defeat, it described the subject as a necessary stumbling block in the march toward the cure. This was one of the rare occasions when SCP-049 appeared genuinely shaken, pausing mid-interview and staring silently at the floor before demanding further subjects. During a long-term bovine trial, SCP-049 injected the corpse with various fluids, announcing that it was balancing the humors. After days of dissection, it demanded a surge of energy to complete the cure. Researchers, substituting modern equipment for its requested lightning rod, provided an electric cattle prod. When applied, the reanimated body rose with its head inverted and its limbs bent backward, shambling grotesquely before collapsing again. To observers, it was a failure. To SCP-049, it was evidence that his theories were sound, if not yet perfected. Repeated attempts to redirect SCP-049 towards scientific explanation ended in frustration. When asked to describe the pestilence in empirical terms, it grew agitated, insisting that the disease was real though invisible to common senses. It chastised staff for mocking progress and compared their skepticism to ignoring rotten beams until the structure collapsed. Its journals, confiscated for study, were filled with archaic anatomical sketches and dense passages in shifting handwriting. Analysis showed a mix of medieval medical theory, cryptic observations, and near-theological proclamations. Failure did not dissuade SCP-049, it only deepened its resolve. Even when presented with proof that its cures produced mindless hostile creatures, the entity maintained they were clean and incapable of spreading the pestilence. To SCP-049, the eradication of personality, memory, and autonomy was not failure, but deliverance. the Foundation came to realize that experiments with this entity could never truly succeed in the conventional sense. Each trial only reinforced SCP-049's conviction and revealed further how alien its perception of medicine had become. By the time the 6th month of testing concluded, a consensus emerged among researchers. SCP-049's fixation on the pestilence was unshakable, its procedures irredeemably destructive, and further experimentation with living humans an unacceptable risk. Containment protocols were amended to prohibit the use of human test subjects altogether. Still, SCP-049 continued to petition daily, insisting that without proper patience, its progress toward the cure would be delayed, and humanity would suffer as a result. The Foundation was left with the uneasy awareness that denial only postponed the inevitable confrontations with the entity's demands. Recovered documentation from SCP-049's containment added another dimension to the entity's already troubling profile. The first of these materials were the journals it carried at the time of capture, thick, leather-bound tomes written in dense, archaic script. Pages were filled with elaborate anatomical sketches, diagrams of humors and organs, and annotations blending recognizable medical terminology with cryptic references to corruption, purity, and the scourge. Researchers noted that many entries ended with phrases such as "cured at last," or "a step closer," always followed by the same symbol, a circle with 4 intersecting lines, possibly SCP-049's personal sigil. Audio recordings of interviews revealed the extent of its obsession. In one session, SCP-049 lectured for nearly 2 hours on the balance of bodily humors, insisting that modern medicine's abandonment of such theory was a betrayal of the fundamentals of health. When pressed for clarification, it grew increasingly animated, slamming its hand against the table and warning that Foundation staff were allowing the pestilence to breed in your very halls. The audio captured moments of unsettling intensity, the voice rising from soft, paternal cadence to near snarling rage before falling back into calm, almost apologetic tones. Surveillance footage provided equally disturbing insights. In one recording, SCP-049 was seen pacing its chamber long into the night, muttering to itself in a mixture of English and French. At one point, it stopped before the observation window, tilted its head upward, and addressed the unseen staff directly. "You cough when you sleep, Doctor. It is a symptom. Do not ignore it." No such cough had ever been documented in the researcher it appeared to address, yet days later the individual reported an unexplained fever. The illness was ultimately diagnosed as common influenza, but the psychological effect was lasting. The doctor requested reassignment shortly afterward. Perhaps most unsettling were fragments of correspondence intercepted prior to SCP-049's capture. French police records contained references to anonymous letters sent to families of the missing in Montauban. These letters, written in precise calligraphy, claimed that their loved ones had been relieved of their suffering and would soon walk again, purified. While no signatures were found, handwriting comparison to SCP-049's journals was near identical. One redacted file, later declassified in part, contained a transcript of a conversation SCP-049 held with itself when it believed it was unobserved. Picked up by hidden microphones, the entity seemed to be addressing an imaginary interlocutor. SCP-049. The patient resisted, yes, but resistance is natural. Pain is natural. They will not thank me now, but one day when the pestilence is gone, they will rise and bow to the cure. Even you cannot deny that. Even you, my shadow. The remainder of the monologue dissolved into unintelligible murmurs, though the phrase, "my shadow," repeated several times. Analysts debated whether this indicated auditory hallucinations, ritual behavior, or communication with an external influence. Further addenda included medical diagrams from SCP-049's later journals, which showed increasing abstraction. Early entries depicted human anatomy with accuracy, but later ones twisted into grotesque configurations, organs overlapping, limbs branching into multiple directions, and veins forming complex geometric shapes. Researchers concluded that these sketches reflected SCP-049's shift from rational experimentation into fully anomalous theorization, charting a path where medicine and metaphysics blurred into one. The culmination of these recovered documents suggested not merely an entity experimenting in isolation, but a mind convinced of its divine obligation. Each note, transcript, and drawing reinforced SCP-049's self-image as a savior against an invisible plague, a lone physician fighting on humanity's behalf. To the Foundation, however, these materials were chilling evidence that SCP-049 was not guided by reason, but by a consuming, pathological doctrine, one that threatened to spread through both flesh and thought if not contained. Internal records from Site-19 revealed that not all Foundation personnel agreed on how SCP-049 should be managed. While its lethal abilities and grotesque cures were undeniable, some staff argued that its cooperative behavior, articulate speech, and medical knowledge merited deeper collaboration. Others countered that even limited engagement placed researchers at risk of indoctrination, or worse, becoming the next subject of its experiments. These opposing views led to bitter disputes within containment committees, where the line between research and enabling the anomaly blurred dangerously. A faction of younger researchers, fascinated by SCP-049's journals, insisted that further study might unlock anomalous principles of biology. They pointed to the fact that SCP-049-2 instances did exhibit active biological processes, however distorted, and argued this hinted at knowledge beyond the Foundation's grasp. Some speculated that SCP-049 had access to an ancient or forgotten medical tradition, one that might explain both its powers and its unyielding belief in the pestilence. These staff members lobbied for carefully controlled human testing, claiming the potential gains outweighed the moral cost. In contrast, senior personnel emphasized the dangers of exposure. Reports surfaced of researchers who began adopting SCP-049's terminology, referring to coworkers as symptomatic, or joking grimly about balancing their humors. Psychological evaluations revealed subtle shifts in worldview among those who interacted with the entity too often. The concern grew that SCP-049's obsession was contagious, not biologically, but ideologically. A quiet directive was issued discouraging unnecessary contact, though it was never formally codified. Censorship became an increasing tool in the struggle to maintain control. Sections of interview transcripts were redacted before circulation, particularly those where SCP-049 spoke persuasively of its mission. Some argued this was a necessary safeguard, preventing the spread of dangerous ideas. Others criticized it as intellectual dishonesty, claiming the Foundation was hiding truths even from its own staff. The debate escalated after the death of Dr. Ham, when evidence of procedural failures was quietly suppressed to protect Site-19's reputation. Several staff who raised concerns were reassigned without explanation. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated that high-level Foundation figures may have considered leveraging SCP-049's abilities. Rumors suggested that proposals were drafted to weaponize its lethal touch or to study reanimated 049-2 entities as potential assets in containment operations. While no such program was officially acknowledged, the persistence of these claims indicated a deeper fracture. Was SCP-049 a threat to be locked away, or a tool too valuable to ignore? The most striking indication of internal conflict came from a classified memorandum later leaked in fragments. It contained heated correspondence between site directors debating whether SCP-049 should be terminated. One line, attributed to an unnamed overseer, read, "If we destroy every anomaly we do not understand, we blind ourselves to what could be salvation." Another in rebuttal stated simply, "Salvation that costs us our humanity is no cure at all." What became clear from these disputes was that SCP-049 did not only alter the bodies of its victims, it reshaped the minds of those who studied it. Even within the most disciplined organization on Earth, its influence sowed division, secrecy, and doubt. The Foundation's mandate to contain and research anomalies was itself tested by the presence of a being whose every word and action forced staff to question whether they were suppressing a delusion or standing in the way of a cure humanity could never comprehend. The defining escalation occurred on April 16, 2017, when SCP-049, after months of relative compliance, turned suddenly and fatally on one of its closest observers. Dr. Raymond Ham, who had conducted the majority of interviews, entered the chamber for what was intended to be another routine session. Reports indicate that SCP-049 grew anxious upon seeing him, remarking on his pallor and asking if he felt well. Dr. Ham insisted the interview proceed as scheduled, at which point SCP-049 placed its hand upon him. Witnesses described the moment as instantaneous. Dr. Ham collapsed lifelessly before any alarms could be raised. Due to a lapse in security protocols, his body remained in the chamber for 3 hours. When recovery personnel finally breached the room, they found that SCP-049 had already conducted a full procedure. Dr. Ham had been converted into an SCP-049-2 instance, staggering aimlessly within the chamber, its chest cavity altered grotesquely. The reanimated body was destroyed on site, but the psychological blow to the containment team was irreversible. For the first time, SCP-049's obsession had claimed the life of a trusted Foundation staff member rather than a disposable subject. The aftermath was chaotic. SCP-049 was interrogated by Dr. Theron Sherman, who demanded an explanation. The transcripts revealed SCP-049's unwavering certainty. It insisted Dr. Ham had been infected with the pestilence and that killing him was an act of mercy. Sherman pressed for evidence, pointing out that Ham had been healthy, but SCP-049 grew increasingly agitated, declaring that the pestilence presents in unforeseeable fashions and that only it possessed the wisdom to detect it. Its conviction was chilling. To SCP-049, Ham had not been murdered. He had been cured. Containment privileges were revoked immediately. Where once it had been permitted animal cadavers and occasional discourse, SCP-049 was now barred from all direct experimentation. Even simple interviews became tightly controlled, with multiple guards stationed outside the chamber at all times. SCP-049 protested vehemently, claiming the Foundation was obstructing progress, warning that without its intervention, humanity would fall to the pestilence unchecked. The entity ranted for hours, pressing itself against the glass, voice breaking between rage and desperation. The breach marked a turning point. No longer was SCP-049 viewed as a curious, if dangerous, physician lost in obsession. It was now classified as a direct threat, capable of striking even seasoned researchers it had interacted with for months. Trust, once cautiously extended, was permanently severed. Foundation reports circulated quietly, speculating that SCP-049's long period of calm compliance had been strategic, that it had patiently awaited the right opportunity to expand its work beyond the limits imposed. Dr. Ham's death also widened the fracture among staff. Some insisted it proved the entity could never be trusted, that termination was the only rational path. Others whispered that Ham's death was a tragedy, but also a revelation, that perhaps SCP-049's detection of an invisible ailment was real, that perhaps Ham had been infected with something beyond conventional understanding. These whispers grew more dangerous than the entity itself, fostering paranoia that anyone, even the healthiest researcher, might secretly harbor the pestilence. As weeks passed, SCP-049 alternated between sullen silence and impassioned pleas. On one occasion, microphones picked up the entity whispering repeatedly, "He was sick. I saved him. He was sick." Another recording captured long stretches of sobbing, broken intermittently by frenzied declarations that only it could save the world. Yet when approached directly, SCP-049 regained composure, straightening its posture and speaking with clinical certainty, as though its outbursts had never occurred. The Ham incident thus became both a physical and psychological breach. It proved containment was fragile, and that the anomaly's obsession could override months of control without warning. More dangerously, it demonstrated the extent of SCP-049's influence, not only over the corpses it reshaped, but over the living minds who studied it. For the Foundation, the question was no longer how to study SCP-049, but whether its continued existence inside Site-19 posed a greater threat than the unknown pestilence it so desperately claimed to fight. In the weeks following the Ham incident, containment protocol was rewritten with finality. SCP-049 was stripped of all privileges. No more animal cadavers, no more interviews without multiple armed guards present, no more opportunity to lecture staff on the nature of its work. Its journals were confiscated, its requests denied, and its bag, though still carried, was subject to constant surveillance. The entity did not resist these changes outwardly, but its behavior shifted. Where once it greeted researchers with polite flourishes, now it sat motionless for hours, muttering to itself, occasionally scratching at the walls with its gloved fingers as if testing their strength. When questioned weeks later by Dr. Elijah Itkin, SCP-049 showed no remorse for Ham's death. Instead, it framed the act as tragic but necessary, claiming that the Foundation's refusal to allow human experimentation hindered its progress. It suggested that living subjects were the key, that cadavers offered too little insight, and that the true cure must begin with the spark of life still present. The entity insisted Ham's transformation had provided important lessons, even as staff recoiled from the grotesque reanimated form they had destroyed. Internally, the Foundation debated termination. Proposals circulated to neutralize SCP-049 permanently, citing the risk of further containment breaches. Yet hesitation prevailed. The Overseer Council deemed the entity's knowledge, however deranged, potentially valuable. Termination, they argued, would erase any chance of understanding the mechanics of its lethal touch or the anomaly sustaining SCP-049-2 instances. As such, SCP-049 was reclassified under stricter protocols but preserved for indefinite study. Psychological reports indicated that containment personnel continued to suffer from SCP-049's presence. Nightmares, paranoia, and subtle shifts in language persisted. Even under silence orders, researchers found themselves echoing its terminology, speaking of symptoms, corruption, or cures. Some began avoiding direct eye contact with colleagues, privately fearing that they might be carriers of the unseen pestilence. A handful requested reassignment, citing the entity's influence as unbearable. In its final interviews before restrictions were locked, SCP-049 spoke with unsettling conviction. "You cannot cage salvation," it told Dr. Itkin, leaning forward across the table. "The pestilence creeps even here, into your halls, into your lungs. I alone hold the cure, and though you deny me, you will beg for it when the dying begins." When pressed to identify the pestilence, it gave no concrete explanation, only abstractions: decay of the spirit, corruption of the will, the slow erosion of mankind's essence. The Foundation closed the file with the conclusion that the pestilence, as SCP-049 defined it, was unverifiable. Whether it represented a literal disease, a metaphysical condition, or a delusion born of obsession remained unresolved. What was clear was that SCP-049 would continue its crusade as long as it existed, convinced of its singular role in curing humanity. Resolution came not in discovery but in containment. SCP-049 was indefinitely confined, denied access to test subjects, its research halted. Site-19 logged the case as one of containment rather than progress, an anomaly to be watched, not engaged. For now, the Plague Doctor sat in silence, the mask forever fixed, the bag at its side, whispering to itself that it was the cure. The final report issued by the Containment Committee was blunt. SCP-049 remains a Euclid-class anomaly. Engagement beyond minimal observation is prohibited. Further study risks contamination, not of the body, but of the mind. Let it sit in its chamber. Let it believe in its cure. The world may never know if the pestilence was real, but we cannot afford the cost of finding out.